What happens when carrying wisdom openly is no longer possible? Throughout history, knowledge has usually traveled in the open. Parents teaching children, teachers guiding students, communities gathering to tell their stories, craftspeople patiently showing apprentices what their own hands had learned through years of practice. For most of human history, wisdom survived because it was shared. And yet, history also preserves another recurring movement. Sometimes knowledge begins to disappear from public life, not because it no longer matters, but because something changes. As civilization collapses, a government begins persecuting certain beliefs. A tradition becomes so complex that it cannot be easily understood without years of experience. Or a community simply realizes that some kinds of wisdom lose something when reduced to information alone. Across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, human beings seem to respond in remarkably similar ways. They build containers, places, communities, traditions, relationships, ways of carrying wisdom until the world is ready to receive it again. Some people know those containers as monasteries, others as guilds, others as oral traditions, others as mystery schools. Still others simply know them as families. Whether those different containers ultimately served wisdom well isn't the question we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to ask something much simpler. What happens when carrying wisdom openly is no longer possible? And perhaps by walking through a few rooms from history, we'll discover that humanity has been answering that question in remarkably similar ways for thousands of years. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. History is filled with moments when knowledge moves freely. Children learn from parents, students gather around teachers, communities pass stories from one generation to the next. A craftsperson places a tool into the hands of an apprentice, not simply explaining what to do, but patiently demonstrating what years of practice have made almost instinctive. For most of human history, this is how wisdom traveled, openly, relationally, one life shaping another. And yet, history also preserves another recurring movement. Sometimes that ordinary pattern is interrupted. A library burns, a people are scattered from their homeland, a government begins persecuting certain beliefs, a language begins disappearing as older generations pass away. A tradition grows so deep that it becomes difficult to communicate through words alone. Suddenly, carrying wisdom in the open is no longer simple. The question changes. Not what should we teach, but how do we keep it from being lost? Across history, civilizations answered that question in remarkably different ways. Some committed their traditions to writing. Others entrusted them to memory. Some gathered in homes. Others retreated to monasteries. Some taught only through apprenticeship. Others preserved their wisdom in song, ceremonies, symbols, and stories that could survive even when books could not. The methods were different. The circumstances were different. And yet they all seem to be responding to the same quiet challenge. How do you carry something precious through a world that no longer makes carrying it easy? Perhaps that question is older than any one civilization, and perhaps it explains why, again and again, humanity keeps inventing new ways to protect what it believes is worth remembering. Once I began looking for this pattern, I started noticing something surprising. History preserves more than one answer to the problem of carrying wisdom through difficult times. It preserves many. Different civilizations responded in remarkably different ways. And yet, beneath those differences, they often seem to be solving the same human problem. When the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, Jewish life could no longer revolve around a single sacred space. Rather than allowing their tradition to disappear, rabbinic communities gradually reshaped the way knowledge was carried. Study, teaching, discussion, and community became living containers through which wisdom could continue traveling across generations. Elsewhere, another community was solving a remarkably similar problem. The first Christians often gathered quietly in homes when public worship became dangerous. Their communities became more than places to meet. They became places where stories, teaching, and hope could survive during periods of persecution. Elsewhere, entirely different kinds of knowledge found entirely different containers. A medieval craft guild didn't simply teach someone how to shape wood or carve stone. Years of apprenticeship allowed skills to pass from one generation to the next through practice, correction, patience, and relationship. Some things simply couldn't be learned from a written page. Many indigenous cultures preserve ceremonies, languages, ecological knowledge, and spiritual traditions through carefully protected oral teachings. These weren't always protected because they were secret. Often they were protected because they were sacred, relational, and deeply connected to lived experience. Different cultures, different histories, different kinds of wisdom, and yet they all seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. When carrying knowledge openly becomes difficult, human beings rarely stop carrying it. They change the container. Perhaps that's the pattern we've been walking toward all along. Not that civilizations repeatedly invent mystery schools, but that civilizations repeatedly adapt the way wisdom travels whenever the world changes around them. As these stories began gathering together, another question slowly emerged. Not simply why different civilizations created different containers, but why some forms of wisdom seem to require them. Not every kind of knowledge asks the same thing of us. Anyone can read the recipe for bread. Only baking it teaches your hands when the dough is ready. Anyone can read about compassion. Living through suffering often teaches it differently. Anyone can memorize the notes of a song. Playing it year after year teaches something no page can fully contain. Perhaps that's why throughout history, some traditions distinguish between information and transformation. The ancient Eleusinian mysteries, held in Greece for nearly 2,000 years, welcomed participants into ceremonies they were expected not to describe publicly afterward. Historians continue debating exactly what took place there, but many agree that the experience itself was considered more important than any explanation of it. The Pythagorean communities practiced mathematics, philosophy, and disciplined ways of living together. Some teachings were shared openly. Others were introduced gradually through commitment, practice, and relationship. Monastic communities copied manuscripts, preserved learning, and cultivated lives of contemplation through rhythms that could not simply be reduced to written instruction. Even the earliest scientific societies often met privately, not because knowledge itself demanded secrecy, but because the political or religious climate sometimes did. Different cultures, different purposes, different kinds of wisdom, and yet they seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. Some knowledge can be transferred as information. Other kinds of wisdom seem to require participation, relationship, practice, and time. Perhaps that's why humanity repeatedly develops places where wisdom can be lived before it's fully understood. Not because knowledge belongs to a select few, but because some truths seem to reveal themselves most fully through experience. If history repeatedly teaches us why civilizations create protected containers for wisdom, it also teaches us something else. Every container carries a risk. Not because protection is wrong, but because every human institution eventually faces the same quiet temptation to begin protecting itself instead of protecting the wisdom it was created to carry. History offers many examples. A religious community created to preserve compassion can slowly become more concerned with preserving its own authority. A guild established to protect craftsmanship can become more interested in protecting membership than cultivating excellence. A scientific institution founded to pursue truth can become resistant to ideas that challenges its own assumptions. Even families, schools, and communities sometimes discover that traditions originally created to give life can gradually become difficult to question simply because they've existed for so long. Perhaps this isn't unique to any one religion or any one culture or any one organization. Perhaps it's simply one of the recurring challenges of being human. The container slowly begins confusing itself with what it carries. Protection becomes possession. Stewardship becomes ownership. Discernment becomes gatekeeping. Tradition becomes rigidity. None of those changes actually happen all at once. More often, they happen gradually, one decision, one generation, one small compromise at a time. Which may be why history also preserves another recurring movement. Again and again, individuals arise who gently ask whether the container is still serving the wisdom, or whether the wisdom has quietly become secondary to the container itself. Perhaps that's why renewal appears so often throughout history. Not because every institution is destined to become corrupt, but because every generation eventually inherits the responsibility of asking the same honest question. Is this still carrying life? Or have we begun protecting the container more carefully than the wisdom it was created to hold? Perhaps that's why these stories have stayed with me. Not because they convinced me that every protected tradition was wise, and certainly not because every institution succeeded in carrying what it hoped to preserve. History is far too honest for that. Instead, they've invited me to ask a different question. Not should wisdom always be public, or should wisdom always be protected, but something much quieter. What kinds of wisdom can only be carried through relationship? Some lessons can be learned from a page. Others seem to ask something more of us. Time, practice, trust, experience. Perhaps that's why every generation eventually becomes both student and teacher. We inherit something we did not create. We live with it, we test it, we add something of our own. And then, whether we realize it or not, we begin handing it to someone else. Sometimes that happens through families, sometimes through friendships, sometimes through classrooms, sometimes through communities, sometimes through books, and sometimes conversations like this one. The containers continue changing. The work remains remarkably familiar, which makes me wonder, what wisdom has been entrusted to me? What am I still learning through experience rather than information? And what deserves to be carried forward? And perhaps most importantly, am I protecting the container or the wisdom it was created to carry? No one can answer those questions for us. Each generation answers them in its own way. Perhaps that's how wisdom survives. Not because history guarantees it, not because institutions preserve it perfectly, but because ordinary people again and again choose to carry something they believe is worth passing forward. And perhaps without always realizing it, we become one of those containers too. And what happens when the container begins forgetting what it was created to carry? That will be a story for another day. Come back next week where we talk about the adversary. Until then, thank you for helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. I'll see you there.